Whether America experiences a second spike of COVID-19 cases or not, it seems certainly the case that by the time the general election rolls around, there are still going to be significant concerns about in-person voting. Thus, the increase in interest in people being able to vote from home. But unfortunately, right now, your ability to do that could well end up depending on which state you live in and how old you are. And joining us now to break this down and what could potentially be done to change this situation is Jason Harrow, the Executive Director and Chief Counsel of Equal Citizens. Jason, welcome to the Damage Report.
Great to be here.
I'm glad to have you on. Now, you've been involved in a report that talks about age discrimination in at-home voting. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found, the current state of this sort of discrimination across America?
Yeah, so as you said right at the top, it's not, we don't have one presidential election, as people know, right? We have 50 different elections run in 50 different states, and the rules differ in each of those states. Well, luckily, in over half the states, people can just ask for a mail ballot, ask for an absentee ballot, and they get one. They don't have to say why. But unfortunately, in over a dozen states, people do have to give a reason, except there's this weird exception. In 8 states, that you don't have to give a reason if you're over a certain age. That age is 60 years old in Tennessee and 65 and older in some other states like Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. And basically those states are just saying, hey, if you hit a certain age, we're going to give you choices. We're going to make it really easy for you to vote by mail, vote absentee, go to the polling place if you want. But if you're younger than that, you have to give us an excuse. You have to be away from the county or the state, right? And that's the kind of distinction that we're finding is going to have a huge impact in this COVID world.
And so I sort of understand commonsensically when they're putting this together, it seems like, well, this is a group that's going to have the most reason to not be able to go and vote in person. But now that's sort of a universal condition. None of us wants to go or shouldn't feel super comfortable going and voting in person with the way things are. And so now there are constitutional implications, correct? That this is actual age discrimination.
Absolutely. So the thing about these laws that makes them illegal is that we have an amendment that addresses specifically age discrimination voting. It's called the 26th Amendment. It's not the most popular amendment. It's not the First Amendment, right? It's not the Second Amendment that people are talking about guns. But it's a really important amendment that was passed in 1971. It primarily lowered the voting age to 18. People may not know this. I didn't know this until, I went to law school and started studying history. But for a lot of years, people could go to war when they were 18, 19, 20, and they couldn't vote. Well, we solved that with an amendment. But the amendment did more than that. It said that when it comes to the right to vote, there can be no denial or abridgment of that right on account of age if you're over 18, period. So that to us says you can't make it easier for one group to vote than another group to vote based on age. You've got to use, real things that matter, right? If you're going to have absentee ballots that require an excuse, which our group thinks is ridiculous in 2020, right? Everyone has an excuse that there is a pandemic going on. But if you're going to require an excuse, you have to make it based on whether that excuse is real. You can't just pick an age and say over it, it's easy, under it, it's hard.
Yeah. And so, as you alluded to, the law differs based on the state that you're in, but there are also now challenges to these provisions in some of the states, correct?
There are. So there's lawsuits about both COVID generally in a lot of places, but also this age restriction specifically in Texas, in Indiana. We're thinking about bringing it in other states. Tennessee, as I mentioned, is a state. Missouri just passed a law that makes it harder for young people to vote absentee than older people. So we hope that these challenges come everywhere and that the courts strike them down. And it's a mixed record so far.
And so, look, I would love to imagine that this is sort of a combination of oversights that when the laws weren't set up, they couldn't have predicted that, we would need universal mail, voting, those sorts of things. But we also know that 60, 65 plus voters are not exactly the same as everyone else. They vote at higher rates. They also don't necessarily support the same party as, the entirety of the population at large might. And so it seems like it's not ridiculous to assume that if these laws persist until November And if many younger people are disenfranchised, as they have been in a number of other instances, that this could have actual political consequences in the election. Do you think that that's a fair assessment?
I do. I mean, there's a reason that President Trump has been talking about that he's against vote by mail. It's ripe for fraud, except for who? Except for older voters and except for military voters, right? Who vote by mail at very high rates. Well, how is it possible that someone age 65, no risk of fraud, and age 63, huge fraudulent risk, or 53? That's not real, right? That's just playing politics. And the Constitution doesn't let any party play politics, right? The Constitution says that there is a right to vote, and states have to make it the same right for people of all ages, as long as you're over 18.
Now, I know that the report is obviously focused on the implications having to do with mail-in voting, but I do want to just double down on the fact that there is quite a bit of evidence, right, that younger voters have been targeted by voter suppression measures in the past. Is that fair to say that as a group they've been targeted more often, perhaps, than middle-aged voters specifically or senior citizens?
Very fair. I mean, they're an easy target. We both took a look at the case law and ran some numbers, and they're pretty troubling. In terms of the case law, we partnered with the Andrew Goodman Foundation and their general counsel, who's Yael Bromberg, who's a leading scholar of the 26th Amendment. And she litigated a case in Florida where basically Florida was making it impossible for students to vote and register, right? They had to jump through extra hoops. And the court said, well, obviously students are more likely to be younger. You can't just do that to students. Everyone has the right to vote. And so the court struck that down. We also ran some numbers for our report where we compared how many people are using vote by mail in these states that make it harder for young people than older people versus the national average. And the difference is like really stark. It's just really obvious what's going on, right? Young people are using vote by mail at less than 5-6% rate in these specific states, whereas in states where you don't need an excuse or where it's much easier to do it, those same groups are using it at 20%, 25%. They like it. It's a great way to vote, especially in this current pandemic. But these laws are making it harder for young people than old people, and that's just not constitutional.
Yeah. So if people want to get involved and support the efforts in some of these states to overturn these sorts of provisions, what can they do? And is it likely that much can be done before the general election in the fall?
It is. So if viewers don't know, there really is some optimism here because there's a wave of lawsuits around the country and legislative activity around the country. And a lot of election administrators, the people in the Secretary of State's office, run elections. So that's one thing people can do is contact this little known office. Places like Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, where they're still enforcing these laws, Tennessee. Contact the Secretary of State's office and say that this law is unfair. Oftentimes, they do have ways of creating exceptions given this emergency situation. So that's one thing. The other thing is they can support the lawsuits. There was unfortunately really bad decision out of Texas. Initially, the plaintiffs challenging this age restriction had won, then they lost. Now we'll sort of see what happens. So if you go to our website, which is equalcitizens.us, you can sign up and follow along. There will be a time to submit a brief to various courts in various states, and the more people, the more support we've got. That makes an impact, right? People don't. Yeah. Judges are people too. They read the news. They see who's for stuff and against it.
Awesome. Jason Harrow of Equal Citizens, thank you for joining us and breaking down this important issue.
Of course. Have a good day.
You too.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.